Hello, everyone. Welcome to Monday night, Indigo Saga. It's lovely to see you. Looks like folks are still arriving, parking their cars, walking into the farmhouse, enjoying the night air. Tonight I will invite in our first sit us to enjoy a guided meditation. And then after that, we'll have a period of walking meditation and then a second sit. And then I'll share with you some thoughts I have about the Four Noble Truths. We're going back to lesson 1, which is a lesson that keeps on giving great rewards each time we visit it. So it had been a while. So let's go ahead and find our seats. Feel the floor under our feet, the earth. Notice the temperature of the air on our skin. Notice any place in our body where we're feeling tension. Let go of any thoughts that we have about the busyness or the accomplishments or what's left undone in our day. Any concerns for the future. Let's just show up to the present moment right here. And begin to bring our awareness to our in-breath and our out-breath. Notice where you feel that sensation of breathing. Perhaps if you're sleepy, it'd be more helpful to feel the awareness down in your belly. Or if you're agitated, maybe just feel the air moving across your nostrils. And I'll invite a couple sounds of the bell. Aware of my body, I breathe in. Smiling to my body, I breathe out. In, aware of body. Out, smiling. Looking at the roots of the pain in my body, I breathe in. Smiling to the roots of the pain in my body, I breathe out. In, roots of pain. Out, smiling. Aware of the contents of my mind, I breathe in. Smiling to the contents of my mind, I breathe out. Aware of mind, smiling. Looking at the roots of the pain in my mind, I breathe in. Smiling to the roots of the pain in my mind, I breathe out. Roots of mind's pain, smiling. Looking at the roots of the pain of fear, I breathe in. Smiling to the roots of the pain of fear, I breathe out. Roots of fear, smiling. Looking at the roots of the feeling of insecurity, I breathe in. Smiling to the roots of the feeling of insecurity, I breathe out. Roots of insecurity, smiling. Looking at the roots of the feeling of sadness, I breathe in. Smiling to the roots of the feeling of sadness, I breathe out. Roots of sadness, smiling. Looking at the roots of the feeling of anger, I breathe in. Smiling to the roots of the feelings of anger, I breathe out. Roots of anger, smiling. Looking at the roots of the feeling of jealousy, I breathe in. Smiling to the roots of the feelings of jealousy, I breathe out. Roots of jealousy, smiling. Looking at the roots of the feeling of attachment, I breathe in. Smiling to the roots of the feelings of attachment, I breathe out. Roots of attachment, smiling. Looking at the roots of the feeling of being caught, I breathe in. Smiling to the roots of the feeling of being caught, I breathe out. Roots of being caught, smiling. Looking at the roots of the feeling of joy, I breathe in. Smiling to the roots of the feeling of joy, I breathe out. Roots of joy, smiling. Looking at the roots of the joy of freedom, I breathe in. Smiling to the roots of joy of freedom, I breathe out. Roots of joy of freedom, smiling. Looking at the roots of joy, of letting go, I breathe in. Smiling to the roots of the joy of letting go, I breathe out. Roots of joy of letting go, smiling. Looking at the roots of the joy of release, I breathe in. Smiling to the roots of the joy of release, I breathe out. Roots of joy of release, smiling. Looking at the roots of the joy of a neutral feeling, I breathe in. Smiling to the roots of a neutral feeling, I breathe out. Roots of neutral feeling, smiling. We'll begin a period of walking meditation next. And in this period, we will shift our awareness into our footsteps, lightly upon the earth. Breathing in, we can take one step with our right foot. Experience the miracle of walking. Breathing out, we can take a step with our left foot and feel the deep gratitude to have the capacity to walk. And if for any reason walking is challenging for you, you can use this as a time to enjoy another round of sitting meditation. So on the first sound of the bell, please rise. On the next sound of the bell, we'll bow to the enlightened being of each of our Sangha members. And on the third sound, we'll begin our walking in mindfulness. Now let us enjoy a period of silent meditation. Again, I'll invite 3 sounds of the bell. So the Buddha is a term that means the enlightened one. And this man's name was actually Siddhartha Gautama. Sorry, Gautama. Siddhartha Gautama. And he was a prince that lived almost 2,600 years ago. And when he was 29, he left the palace and pursued what was fairly common in the day, which was a spiritual quest for enlightenment, and spent 6 years studying, working with different teachers, trying out different practices. And then one day he sat down under a Bodhi tree and he said, I am not standing up from this position until I have attained enlightenment. I can only think that he must have known he was very close. And then indeed he became enlightened. And then it's said that he spent 49 days enjoying the peace of his enlightenment. And at the end of those 49 days, he went to a place called Deer Park, which is in the town of Sarnath. And he met with 5 of his friends who he had been studying and wandering around with, practicing with different teachers. And he said, I've become enlightened. And his friends said, no, we know you. But they could tell from his being that something indeed was different. So they asked him to teach him something. And what he taught them was the 4 Noble Truths. So this is the very first lesson. And it is about recognizing and acknowledging our suffering, looking deeply into it to discover what it is that brought our suffering about. And then to prescribe for ourselves a way to end the suffering once we understand it. And that prescription transforms the suffering. So who does this? Today, who does this? This practice of the 4 Noble Truths. We do. And the one who is doing it, we can think of as the Buddha within us, that has the wisdom to look deeply inside of our own suffering and to transform it. Now, because this was the first teaching, well, let me say it differently. This was a very important teaching of the Buddha's, and he taught this his entire life, it turns out, and way, way into his elder years. Somebody asked him, what is the nature of this teaching? How can you sum it up for us? Because it seems very complex. And the Buddha said, for 45 years, all I have taught is suffering and the transformation of suffering. So if you ever have someone ask you, what is this Buddhism thing about that you do? You could say, it is about suffering and the transformation of suffering. And because there's this word suffering that is often not understood in contemporary society, a lot of people think, oh, Buddhism is just all about suffering, that there's no hope. But as Thich Nhat Hanh said, suffering is not enough. It is about the transformation of suffering, which in its essence is about the art of happiness. Can you hear that in there? You might teach about suffering and the transformation of suffering, but that is about the art of happiness. And part of this practice is, Thich Nhat Hanh teaches us, is that we may go into our garden and see that one tree is sick, but we also have to see all of the other beautiful, healthy trees in the garden. So this practice is really that it's not just about suffering. This transformation of suffering is really quite profound. And that is what we study. There's another piece of this that I think people often misunderstand, is they don't understand what's noble about the Four Noble Truths. If the first truth is that there is suffering, what is it that is noble about our suffering? Well, the Buddha answered that one. And we refer to our suffering as being noble because it shows us the path to freedom and liberation. It is the thing that makes us aware that there is a different direction we can go into. And when we embrace our suffering skillfully, then it reveals the way to peace. That's what makes suffering noble, is it's a great big clue to do something that is more wholesome and healing. So the Four Noble Truths are that there is suffering, that it exists for everyone. It exists in all moments. It exists collectively and individually. There's just suffering. And that the second noble truth is that something is making this suffering. It doesn't come from nothing. The third noble truth is that there is a possibility of well-being. And then the fourth noble truth is that we can live in such a way as to avoid and transform our suffering. So an easy one to look at this is, let's think about Thanksgiving dinner. It's right around the corner. And I don't know about you, but our family has a very traditional meal. And it is a lot of heavy food that I don't normally eat. And I eat a whole lot of it. And that's part of the celebration, to just eat too much. And then I suffer. I don't feel good. I have a bellyache. I can't move, right? So this Thanksgiving suffering is that indeed suffering exists after the meal. I don't feel good. That something is making me suffer. My uncontrolled appetite. That there's a possibility of restoring well-being, which is slow down and stop eating so much. Maybe have a smaller piece of pie. Maybe extend when you serve pie to later in the evening. And then there's a path to avoid suffering, which is to, of course, go back to more moderation. And that moderation is also part of this, in that the Buddha taught us that the path to avoid suffering is about the middle way. So we don't deny ourselves. You know, he very much in his wanderings and in seeking out teachers was practicing asceticism. As a matter of fact, the Buddha almost died in this process because he was practicing so diligently that he was literally starving himself. And then he realized that is a form of violence against ourselves, to go to that extreme of denial of the things that can take care of our health, and that can bring us happiness. So it's not about asceticism. And it's also not about giving in to all of the sensual pleasures. You know, that very much the Buddha said, if you want to live in such a way to avoid suffering, you need to avoid those sense pleasures like fame, overeating, sleeping too much, sexual desire, chasing after material possessions, and then, of course, you know, protecting your health is part of this middle way, as I said. So this notion of moderation is really central to this, and it's also very active in placing yourself in context from moment to moment. There's no formula. So what might be a middle way and moderate in one instance could actually be excess in another instance, and vice versa. So we have to be aware of context. And we also have to be aware that we are, as we practice these Four Noble Truths, we are engaging with the world. This is not about hermitage where we remove ourselves. This is about putting ourselves right into the world and relating to it as thoroughly as possible. When I attended my first retreat back in 2003, I heard Thich Nhat Hanh say that we must be wise enough to know when we are suffering. And this was like a wake-up call. I mean, the alarm just went off because I did not realize that I was suffering. And I had a lot of things going in my life that I was denying or pushing away or thinking it was normal or blaming other people for. I had a lot of stories, right? But what the first noble truth was, and what Thich Nhat Hanh was talking about, is we have to recognize and acknowledge that it's going on, and that we have to touch it with mindfulness, gently. A recent example of this, I think, was after the murder of George Floyd, when particularly white members of Sangha were suddenly aware of profound suffering that had been previously sort of not sinking in for us before. And we were recognizing it and wanted to have a way of acknowledging it. And that's when it was really beneficial to have a Sangha who could come together, a Sangha particularly of white members who could come together and explore what this white experience is all about and how to wake up to this in a way that can be helpful. And so having a Sangha to explore our suffering through the Racial Justice Project has been quite meaningful. We also can explore our suffering more personally through the second body practice. If there's something that is coming up for us, our friends can be very helpful. And so just having friends that are in the practice who understand the nature of suffering, that it's like, yeah, that's your stuff. This is the stuff you get to work with for your own enlightenment. You know, that's really helpful. That they don't buy into it and they don't get carried away by it. And so you can have conversations about your stuff without it being misunderstood. So the first noble truth is about just recognizing and acknowledging that suffering exists. And then the second is to look deeply into the roots of suffering and look at what is feeding this suffering, because nothing can persist without nutriments. There is something that is causing the suffering to persist. And this, I think, again, going back to the example of the Racial Justice Project, is where the study group is so helpful, where we're looking into particular issues and beginning to unpack them with some really insightful writing from folks who understand some of the causes and conditions that have allowed this suffering to persist over time. I know at that first retreat that I attended, when I began to realize I was suffering, and then I started to look into the causes and conditions, I was truly humbled by what I was seeing, that I personally was the source of so much of the suffering in my life, my own unskillfulness. And that's okay. You know, we need to wake up to that at some point. In the Racial Justice Project, we're waking up to the fact that as white people, we've been participating in this, not stopping it. And so it's humbling. And that humbling nature of it is a very important aspect, I think, to understanding suffering. But the third part of it, the third noble truth, is refraining then from doing the things that are perpetuating the suffering. And this is where you get a real sense of empowerment, that what I choose to do really matters in terms of my personal suffering, the suffering of those around me, and the suffering in society, because they all inter-are. So the empowerment is the fact that joy and happiness is something that we can create for ourselves and for those around us. That's very powerful. And again, using the Racial Justice Project as an example, you know, we have the newsletter that is giving us all kinds of ideas for what we can do to break the cycle of suffering. Now, I can tell you a more recent story, and I will, but I want to ask you, as a Sangha, because I've seen your habit energies. Sometimes when I tell a story, y'all feel real bad for me, or y'all think I need encouragement, or a pat on the back, or something like that. Knock it off. I want to tell a story about my suffering, but I want you to hear it as an example so that you can think about your suffering. Okay, so don't bring this story up in Dharma sharing. It's just an example. All right. So recently I was having a conversation with someone, and I realized that I was having some suffering around being a parent of adults. So it wasn't quite like I pictured, and that I was finding it really difficult. So I was able to name the suffering. And then with this conversation, I was able to look more deeply into it. And I saw that my suffering was really coming from a loss of a sense of confidence, that I knew truly how to be of support, and that I could be relevant and an ally to adult children. And this person I was talking to wasn't very familiar with the practice, and they said, oh, maybe you should see a therapist about it. And I said, oh, heck no, I'm a mindfulness practitioner. Just by naming it and seeing that I had lost my confidence, I can refrain from that story now. I can stop it in its tracks because I know it doesn't serve anybody. So I can say, when I have those feelings come up, I can say, oh, hello, doubt. There you are. Thank you for sharing and making your presence known. And now I'm going to ask you to sit over here because I'm going to keep showing up to this moment. And so with that awareness, with this mindfulness of what the causes and conditions were, I was able to release it instantly and transform it. And then avoid the pattern from repeating itself in the future because of the awareness that I had. So that's my story with a recent experience of working through these Four Noble Truths. And I encourage you in Dharma sharing to think about your own stories. But embedded in that conversation was an opportunity to stop have a very calm and lucid reflection, kind of rest with the reality of what was happening for me. And then the healing came because I could see what was at the source of it. So those qualities of resting and calming and healing, they're part of this reflection. And then, of course, the fourth noble truth is living in such a way that we don't create suffering for ourselves and those around us. And that is through the practice of the Noble Eightfold Path, which includes right view, right thinking, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right diligence, right mindfulness, and right concentration. And in our tradition, we have, this gift of the Buddha where he created the 5 precepts, which Thai has completely looked deeply into and given us the 5 mindfulness trainings. And the Noble Eightfold Path is wholly and completely included in those 5 mindfulness trainings. So that's why we take time to regularly visit those trainings and ask if we've had a chance to observe, study, and practice them in the last few weeks, because it is a touchstone for us, a humanist ethic, to live in such a way where we're avoiding suffering for ourselves, our beloveds, and society. I do want to say a word about trauma and triggers and mindfulness, because if there is a trauma and if there is a trigger that is very sensitive for you, to go there mindfully could actually be a re-triggering experience. So you, as your own inner Buddha, need to exercise care and a lot of gentleness and some self-regulation about how you mindfully work with potential trauma triggers or not. I had an experience many years ago where I stepped forward at a request to lead a funeral service, a Buddhist funeral service for a young man who had committed suicide. And his fiancée was, of course, at the funeral. And she said to me, I would love to practice mindfulness, but every time I close my eyes and try to breathe, all I can see is his suicide, because she had witnessed it. And she was actively in trauma. So the first thing, of course, that came to mind is that she's in a mental health crisis and she would benefit from the support of a professional mental health person. So this is no substitute for mental health care or mindfulness practice. The other thought I had was, thinking back to what Thai says about being in the garden and seeing the tree that is so sick, but then also being able to see the other trees in the garden. She had lost the ability to see the whole garden because that ailing issue was right there for her. And so it was a matter of time and kindness and gentleness to relax into an awareness of the whole of life again. I knew that would be part of her process. And then the third thought I had in the conversation I had with her was that I had an overwhelming sense that she just needed to rest from her grief. She needed to have a way of just resting. And I want to come back to that notion of resting. So let's just acknowledge that trauma is something that that we need to handle with much more skill and the support of mental health professionals. But for most of us, most of the time, this issue of resting from whatever is happening in our suffering is vitally important. And it's like Thich Nhat Hanh describes that if we take a pebble and we toss it into a river, and the pebble sinks down to the riverbed, and it is stable, and it sits there, and the water flows past, that our mindfulness practice, our sitting meditation, is very much like settling to the bottom of the riverbed, that we can be still and peaceful there, and that we are aware of what is moving through us and around us without any effort. And that ability to rest our mind and our body is really central to healing and transforming our suffering. So when we feel ready then, and we're in this process of aware of suffering, and that it has causes and conditions, when we're ready, we can look deeply at the wounds of our heart as the objects of our mindfulness. When we're feeling stable, we can look at the wounds of our hearts as the object of our mindfulness, much like we did in the guided meditation that we began the evening with. And we can recognize our suffering. We can say, I know fear is in me. And then we can accept our suffering. I accept that fear is present. Or hate is in me. And I accept that hate is present. Or anger, or jealousy, or grief, or whatever it is. I accept that it is here, in me, in this moment. And then we can embrace it like a mother embraces her only child. I not only accept it, but I embrace my fear. I want to take care of it. I hear it crying in me, and I want to take care of it. So I calmly look into my fear to understand what brought it about. And then, I understand the causes and conditions that caused my baby to cry. And I know now what to do and what not to do. I know what to do and what not to do. It's like a doctor diagnosing a pain. Does this hurt? Does this hurt? I know what to do or what not to do. So when we look deeply into the causes and conditions that bring about suffering, one of the places we can look into is our consumption. And, I use the Thanksgiving example to start with. There is what we consume by our eating, but consumption has more layers to it. We can look at the consumption of our sense impressions. And I talked about that recently with the 5 universal mental formations of contact, awareness, feelings, perception, volition. You might remember that. What we are coming into contact with and what we're putting our awareness in, that is very much our sense impressions that are coming in. And then our volition, what we're aspiring to do in the world, where we're putting our energy, that is also a form of consumption, because it is taking our energy out into the world, and it has consequences. And then finally, we can look at our individual and our collective consciousness. So what are the thoughts that we're having? What is the story in our head? What is the storyline in society? Is it about hatred and despair and separation? Or is it about compassion and unity and helping one another? So it's really good when we're looking at the causes and conditions to just check in with our consumption of our foods, our sense impressions, our aspirations in the world, and our consciousness. And when we are going through this process, what we're doing is we're touching our suffering with compassion for the human condition without judgment. This is what it's like to be alive as a human being right now. And it's that compassion that leads to the transformation of our suffering. Now, I want to say just a couple of words before I close about acknowledging intergenerational suffering, the trauma that is in society with a very long history, because it is part of our collective reality. And some examples of that would be hundreds of years of racial injustice in this nation that has harmed all of us. Another example is thousands of years of violence against the earth and other beings on earth, and that's leading to mass extinction and climate change. And these kinds of multi-generational traumas are part of the notion of there is suffering in the world that is deeply entrenched, that we are witnessing and a part of. And I'd like to close with a poem that I think talks about that kind of entrenched suffering in a way that is helpful. This is a poem by Thich Nhat Hanh, and it is called Always the Same Mind. And it also, I think, reveals the interbeing of suffering and happiness, the capacity for both. So I'm going to share my screen and just read this with you here. The stars and moon still look beautiful on clear nights. The willow bay is still green. The tuya trees waving in the breeze are still gracious. Although we miss our homeland, the plum blossoms on the hill still offer us hospitality. The luxurious vegetation brings more vitality to the hills and strength to the moon. The squash plants have begun to put forth flowers, and children are playing in the sunshine in the front yard. We make books and send them through the mail. Although we live simply, each day of our life is like a festival. The news from the homeland is not encouraging. The temples do not have permission to ring their bells. Many children are left without their parents. Many people are in re-education camps. Writers and artists remain in dead silence. So many boat people, including children, perish in the Gulf of Siam. Love tries hard to express itself. What can we do? Our hands are available. We are ready. What can we do? The answer will certainly come if we know how to remain faithful and calm in the midst of turbulence. The sunshine still calls attention to the hill above. The cherry blossoms are still lovely. Moon and stars still beautiful on clear nights. Willows still green, and the tuya still waves graciously to us.